Brad Pitt became one of the most recognizable faces in the world. He became a Hollywood superstar, an Oscar winner, a leading man whose name could sell a movie before audiences even knew the story. But long before Brad Pitt became Brad Pitt, he was simply one of 3 children growing up in Springfield, Missouri. And beside him was his younger brother, Doug. They shared the same parents, the same hometown, the same childhood, and eventually, the same last name became one of the most recognizable names in Hollywood. But the brothers chose very different lives. Brad left Missouri and built a career in movies. Doug stayed closer to home and built a career of his own. He became an entrepreneur, a businessman, a philanthropist, and eventually Tanzania's first goodwill ambassador. But for years, whenever Doug's name appeared in the public eye, there was almost always another name attached to it. Brad Pitt's brother. That description was accurate, but it was never the whole story. Because Doug Pitt was doing something most people never noticed. He was building an identity in the same family as one of the most famous men on Earth, without trying to become another version of him. And that raises a fascinating question. What is it actually like to watch your brother become Brad Pitt? What happens when millions of people recognize your family name, but almost none of them know what you have accomplished yourself? And perhaps most importantly, how do you build a life of your own when the person standing next to you has become a global celebrity? Doug Pitt's story is not simply about living in the shadow of a famous brother. It is about what happened when he decided that he did not need to compete with that shadow at all. Because while Brad was building a legacy on movie screens, Doug was building one somewhere very different. And the story of how he got there begins long before either brother became famous. Before the cameras, before the red carpets, before Brad Pitt became one of the most recognizable names in the world, there was simply a family growing up in Springfield, Missouri. Brad was born in 1963. Doug followed 3 years later. And their younger sister, Julie, completed the family a few years after that. Their parents, William and Jane Pitt, built a relatively ordinary life in the Midwest. William worked in the trucking business, while Jane worked as a school counselor. The family eventually settled in Springfield, where Brad, Doug, and Julie were raised. It was a long way from Hollywood, and that distance mattered. Brad himself would later remember Springfield as a place surrounded by cornfields, forests, rivers, and the Ozarks. It was the kind of environment where the Pitt children could grow up without the world watching them. They went to school. They played sports. They spent time with friends. And inside their home, Brad was not yet Brad Pitt. He was simply the oldest brother. Doug later recalled that he and Brad were extremely close when they were young. In fact, one family friend described the 2 brothers as being thick as thieves during their early school years. They were close enough that Doug often followed his older brother's lead. Sometimes that meant ordinary sibling adventures. Sometimes it meant Brad testing an idea first and Doug following behind. Their mother even remembered Brad sending Doug ahead during childhood adventures, including skiing trips, where Doug would effectively become the first person to test the hill. It sounds like a small detail, but it gives us a glimpse of what their relationship looked like before fame changed everything. Brad was the older brother. Doug was the younger one. And at that point, nobody knew that one of them would eventually become a global movie star. But there was another difference beginning to emerge. Brad was becoming increasingly fascinated by movies and storytelling. Doug was developing interests of his own. Neither brother had any reason to believe that their futures would eventually look so dramatically different. Then came college, and with it, one of the most important decisions of Brad Pitt's life. Brad attended the University of Missouri, studying journalism and advertising. He was close to graduating, but during his final semester, something changed. Instead of finishing his degree and following the predictable path ahead of him, Brad left school and headed west. Los Angeles was waiting. He arrived with very little money and began trying to break into acting. It was not glamorous. Brad drove limousines. He moved refrigerators. He took small acting jobs. At one point, he even worked dressed as a giant chicken for a restaurant promotion. This was not yet the Brad Pitt the world would eventually know. It was a young man gambling on an uncertain dream. And Doug was close enough to see what was happening. When Doug was around 21, he went to Los Angeles and lived with his brother for several months while Brad was beginning to work in the movie business. That period gave Doug something most people never got to experience. He saw Brad before the fame, before the premieres, before the screaming fans, before the photographers. He saw the uncertainty. And then almost suddenly, things began to move. Brad landed his first movie role and left Los Angeles to film. Doug remained behind for a time, experiencing California for himself. But the family back in Missouri was beginning to realize that Brad's decision to leave college had not been a temporary adventure. He was actually becoming an actor. Then came Thelma and Louise. And everything accelerated. Brad's appearance in the 1991 film introduced him to a much wider audience. Then came A River Runs Through It. Then Legends of the Fall. And suddenly, the young man who had left Missouri without finishing college was becoming one of the most talked about actors in America. For Doug, this was the beginning of a completely different kind of life. His brother was no longer simply the older sibling who had been popular at school. Brad Pitt was becoming a celebrity. And that meant the Pitt family was entering a world none of them had grown up expecting. People began recognizing Brad. Then they began recognizing the family. And eventually, even Doug discovered that being Brad Pitt's brother could turn an ordinary trip into something extraordinary. But Doug did not respond by trying to follow Brad into Hollywood. He went in the opposite direction. While Brad was building a career in front of cameras, Doug began building one behind the scenes. In 1991, he founded a computer company in Springfield. He was creating something that belonged entirely to him. And that decision would become one of the most important parts of his story. Because Doug Pitt was about to discover something that would define his life for decades. He did not have to become another Brad Pitt. He could become Doug Pitt. And that would mean building a name that existed for reasons completely separate from Hollywood. Then the Pitt brothers entered two very different worlds. Brad was moving toward Hollywood. Doug was building a business in Missouri. And for a while, the contrast between their lives was almost impossible to ignore. Brad's career accelerated after Thelma and Louise. Then came A River Runs Through It. Legends of the Fall. Interview with the Vampire. 7. By the mid-1990s, Brad Pitt was no longer simply an actor trying to make it. He was becoming a global star. And Doug was watching it happen from Springfield. But he was sitting around waiting for his brother's success to create opportunities for him. In 1991, Doug founded Service World Computer Center, a technology company in Springfield. That decision is one of the most important details in Doug's story. Because while Brad was building a name that millions of people would recognize, Doug was building something that had nothing to do with movies. He was becoming a businessman. And that meant that when people eventually asked about Brad, Doug had something of his own to talk about. His company, his community, his family, his work, his life. But fame has a strange way of following people who never asked for it. Doug could walk into a room as Doug Pitt. Yet someone else might see him first as Brad Pitt's brother. And that reality became part of his life. In a 2004 interview with the Springfield News leader, Doug described the unusual consequences of having a world-famous brother. He talked about their attention surrounding Brad, but also about the ordinary moments they still shared. They could spend time together in Los Angeles. They could ride ATVs. Or they could simply sit down with cappuccinos and talk. For Doug, those ordinary moments were important because behind the celebrity was still his brother. Not the movie star. Not the face on magazine covers. Just Brad. And there is something revealing in that. Doug didn't describe his relationship with Brad as a competition. He didn't need to become more famous. He didn't need to enter the movie business. He had already chosen a different identity. But that did not mean the comparison disappeared. In fact, it became unavoidable. Every time Doug appeared in a newspaper, a television segment, or at a public event, there was a natural hook: Brad Pitt's brother. It was an easy headline. And sometimes, Doug even played along with it. He participated in humorous campaigns that acknowledged the unusual position he occupied. One of the most memorable examples came years later, when Doug appeared in a humorous Virgin Mobile commercial in which the joke centered on what it might be like to be Brad Pitt's brother. The humor worked because everyone understood the basic premise. Brad was famous. Doug was not. But beneath the joke was something more interesting. Doug had already built a successful life before most people outside Missouri knew much about him. And then his attention began moving toward something even bigger than business. In the mid-2000s, Doug became increasingly involved in community issues in Springfield. At a 2005 Springfield Area Chamber of Commerce meeting, he heard stories about local children struggling with basic necessities. Children without proper clothing. Children going hungry. Children dealing with health and hygiene problems that made it harder to concentrate at school. The stories stayed with him. And according to Doug, one particular story bothered him because the problem seemed so easy to solve. He began asking what could actually be done. That question eventually became Care to Learn. The organization was formally established after Doug responded to those needs by bringing community leaders together and raising funds to provide immediate assistance to students. Care to Learn now describes its mission as addressing urgent health, hunger, and hygiene needs that can keep children from learning. This was a significant shift in Doug's story. He had started as an entrepreneur. Now he was becoming a philanthropist. And importantly, he was simply attaching his brother's celebrity to the problem and walking away. He approached the organization using the same practical mindset he had developed in business. Find the problem. Remove unnecessary barriers. Get help to the person who needs it. And do it quickly. A 2014 profile in Cent. Louis magazine described how Doug wanted Care to Learn to operate with that kind of speed and simplicity. Rather than burying teachers and families in paperwork, the organization aimed to respond directly to immediate needs. That philosophy revealed something about Doug that had little to do with Brad Pitt. He was trying to become a celebrity philanthropist. He was applying his own skills to problems he could see in his community. And that distinction matters, because this is where the story stops being about Brad Pitt's brother. It becomes the story of a man who had built a career, a family, and eventually a philanthropic organization on his own terms. And then came another opportunity that would take Doug far beyond Missouri. In 2010, he was appointed the first Goodwill Ambassador for the United Republic of Tanzania. His work in Africa expanded his philanthropic interests, including water projects through World Serve International. Suddenly, Doug Pitt's story had another chapter. Missouri, business, children in need, Africa, water, community development. And somewhere in the background of all of it was still the same unavoidable fact. His brother was Brad Pitt. But by this point, that fact was no longer the most interesting thing about Doug. Because Brad's fame may have introduced Doug's name to people who otherwise would never have heard it. But it was Doug's own work that gave people a reason to remember it. And that may be the greatest irony in this entire story. The world knew Doug because of Brad. But the more Doug built, the less his story needed Brad to explain it. And yet, there was still one question Doug could never completely escape. What does it feel like to build your own life, while the person standing beside you is one of the most famous men on Earth? Because success is one thing, but being compared to Brad Pitt is an entirely different challenge. And that is where Doug's story becomes much more personal. For Doug Pitt, being Brad Pitt's brother came with opportunities. But it also came with something far more complicated. Attention. When Brad's fame exploded in the 1990s, the Pitt family suddenly found itself dealing with a level of public interest nobody had prepared for. Doug's phone could ring again and again with questions about his brother. Fans appeared at the family home. Reporters searched for information. People wanted photographs. And sometimes, they wanted something from Brad that had nothing to do with Doug's own life. In a 2004 interview with the Springfield News Leader, Doug described the early period of Brad's fame as overwhelming. At one point, he was receiving roughly 8 Brad-related calls a night. People were showing up at the house, and the family eventually had to become much more careful about privacy. That was the part nobody saw in the glamorous photographs. Brad's fame did not stop at the red carpet. It traveled home, and Doug was suddenly one of the people standing between that fame and the rest of the family. He became, almost by accident, the person who dealt with many of the requests directed toward Brad. His mother, Jane, explained that Doug was naturally good at dealing with people, and because he was already in business and comfortable in public, the family gradually allowed him to handle those situations. In other words, Doug was simply living next door to Hollywood. He was sometimes acting as a gatekeeper for it. People would contact him asking for Brad. Some wanted donations. Some wanted introductions. Some simply wanted access. And Doug had to decide what deserved to reach his brother. That responsibility created an unusual position. He was close enough to Brad to understand his life. But he was also far enough away from Hollywood to see how strange the whole phenomenon could become. And there were moments when their attention became difficult to ignore. Doug recalled people showing up at his business simply because they wanted a connection to Brad. Fans could mistake proximity for personal access. And when the national media became particularly interested in Brad, even ordinary family life could become complicated. Yet Doug didn't describe their experience as purely negative. That is important. He openly acknowledged that there were privileges that came with having a famous brother. His family could experience things they otherwise never would have experienced. They attended movie premieres. They met actors. They visited Brad. Their children got to spend time with their famous uncle. But Doug also described the other side of that equation. There was baggage. And that word explains much of his story. Because being Brad Pitt's brother meant living with 2 realities at the same time. One was extraordinary. The other could be exhausting. Doug once summarized the situation in a remarkably honest way. He had good days and bad days about his brother's fame, but overall, he considered it positive and said he wouldn't change it. That is a very different story from the one Hollywood audiences might expect. There is no dramatic feud, no secret rivalry, no evidence that Doug spent his life trying to escape Brad. Instead, there was something much more ordinary. A younger brother watching his older brother become incredibly famous while trying to maintain his own life. And perhaps the clearest evidence of that comes from Doug's decision to remain in Springfield. In a later interview, Doug explained that he had the luxury of raising his children almost anywhere in the world. He chose Springfield. His family was there. His wife's family was there. It was home. And despite everything that came with being Brad Pitt's brother, he chose to build his life there. That choice tells us something. Doug didn't need to physically escape Brad's fame. He simply built a world in which Brad's fame was the center of everything. He had his business, his wife, his children, his friends, his community, his interests, and eventually his philanthropic work. In fact, people who knew Doug described him as successful in his own right. One longtime friend told the Springfield News leader that Brad and Doug simply had different career and lifestyle choices, with Brad accomplished in acting and Doug accomplished in business and community involvement. And that distinction is at the heart of this story. Doug didn't need to prove that he was as famous as Brad. He needed to decide what success meant to him. For Brad, success became movies watched around the world. For Doug, success increasingly became building businesses and helping people in his own community. That second path eventually became much more than a side project. It became one of the defining parts of his identity. In 2005, Doug heard stories about children in Springfield struggling with basic needs. Children without adequate clothing. Children going hungry. Children dealing with health and hygiene problems that made it harder for them to learn. One story in particular stayed with him. A child was being teased because he had to wear his mother's jeans to school. Doug couldn't stop thinking about it. The problem seemed painfully simple, and he believed it should be possible to fix. That reaction eventually helped lead to the creation of Care to Learn. And here is where Doug's story takes another turn. Because his brother's fame had already taught him how quickly people could focus on a name. Doug's philanthropic work gave him an opportunity to focus on something else. The need. Not the celebrity. Not the headline. Not the Pitt name. The child who needed help. Care to Learn was designed around a straightforward idea. When a student has an urgent health, hunger, or hygiene need, the organization should help solve that problem quickly so that child can get back to learning. Doug approached the organization with the mindset of a businessman. Reduce the bureaucracy. Listen to the teachers. Identify the problem. Solve it. And move. That philosophy would eventually take Doug beyond Missouri. But by then, something important had already happened. The question was no longer what is Brad Pitt's brother doing. It had become what is Doug Pitt building. And that difference may be the most important transformation in his entire story. Because Brad's fame may have made Doug's name recognizable. But it was Doug's own choices that gave that name meaning. And the next chapter would take that identity far beyond the Ozarks. From a computer business in Missouri, to children in need, to clean water, to a role on an international stage that very few people would ever associate with the name Pitt. Doug Pitt was about to become known for something other than being Brad Pitt's brother. And this time, Hollywood had almost nothing to do with it. By the time Doug Pitt began expanding his philanthropic work beyond Missouri, something had quietly changed. He was no longer simply the businessman people knew as Brad Pitt's younger brother. He was becoming known for something else. The problems he cared about had become bigger. And one of them was something most people in America rarely had to think about. Clean water. Through his involvement with World Serve International, Doug became increasingly involved in efforts to bring clean and sustainable water systems to communities in Africa. And in 2010, he was appointed the first Goodwill Ambassador for the United Republic of Tanzania. Suddenly, the man whose name was so often introduced through Hollywood had a completely different title. Not actor, not producer, not celebrity, Goodwill Ambassador. It was a remarkable contrast. His brother had built a career around stories told on movie screens. Doug was now traveling into communities where the most important story was not entertainment at all. It was whether people had access to something as basic as safe water. And this was not simply a symbolic position. Doug became involved in projects connected to water access, education, and community development. The work brought him into environments that were almost unimaginably different from the world surrounding his brother's Hollywood career. No red carpet could prepare someone for what it meant to visit communities, where clean water could determine whether children went to school, whether families could stay healthy, and whether people had enough time to focus on building a better future. Doug had entered another world, and perhaps that was exactly why it mattered. Because the further his philanthropic work took him from Hollywood, the less important the comparison with Brad became. The name Pitt still opened doors. There is no reason to pretend otherwise. Doug's connection to Brad gave him an unusual platform. But a platform is not the same thing as a legacy. A famous name can attract attention. It cannot, by itself, build a water system. It cannot run an organization. It cannot solve a community's problems. And it cannot make people trust you after the cameras leave. Those things require work. Doug appeared to understand that distinction. His approach to philanthropy was often practical rather than glamorous. He was interested in measurable outcomes, in finding a problem, understanding it, and figuring out what could actually be done. That mindset connected his business career with his philanthropic one. The same man who had built a technology company in Missouri was now thinking about how to build systems that could help communities thousands of miles away. And the scale of the challenge was completely different. But the principle was surprisingly similar. Identify the problem. Find a solution. Make the solution work. Then move on to the next problem. That became one of the most interesting threads running through Doug Pitt's life. He didn't leave business behind when he entered philanthropy. He brought the mindset with him. And perhaps that is why his story is more complicated than the simple phrase Brad Pitt's brother. Because when you look closer, there are several different Doug Pitts. There is the boy from Springfield, the younger brother, the businessman, the father, the community volunteer, the philanthropist, the international ambassador, and yes, the man whose brother happens to be Brad Pitt. But the order matters. For years, the world tended to reverse it. Brad Pitt first, Doug second, and Doug's own work somewhere underneath. But as his philanthropic career developed, that order became harder to maintain. His name began appearing in places where Hollywood had very little relevance. And that may have been the point. Doug was trying to replace his brother's fame with his own. He was building something different. Something that could exist even if nobody cared who his brother was. That distinction became especially clear through Care to Learn. The organization had started with a local problem in Springfield. But their idea behind it was much larger. A child shouldn't have to sit in a classroom unable to concentrate because they are hungry. A student shouldn't have to miss school because they lack basic hygiene supplies. And a family shouldn't have to choose between an immediate need and getting through the week. Care to Learn was created to respond to those kinds of urgent needs. And Doug's role was not simply to put his name on an organization. He became deeply associated with its growth and mission. The organization says its work has provided millions of dollars in assistance to students across Missouri, helping meet health, hunger, and hygiene needs. That number tells us something. This was no longer a side project. It had become a significant part of Doug's life. And the irony is hard to miss. Brad Pitt's fame had given Doug something he never asked for. Constant comparison, public attention, questions about his brother. But Doug eventually used the visibility that came with the Pitt name to direct attention somewhere else. Toward children, toward communities, toward people who had nothing to do with Hollywood. That is a very different way of dealing with fame. Instead of trying to escape the name, he learned how to use it. And there was another important difference. Brad's career was built on visibility. Doug's philanthropic work was often most successful when the people being helped became more visible than the person helping them. That is a subtle distinction. But it tells us a great deal about the kind of legacy Doug was building. The goal was for people to walk away saying Doug Pitt is famous. The goal was for people to walk away saying something changed. A child got help. A community gained access to water. A family received support. A student was able to stay in school. That kind of impact does not always produce headlines, but it can last much longer than one. And eventually, Doug's work began to reshape the way people viewed him. He was still Brad Pitt's brother. He always would be. But that description became incomplete. It was like describing a building only by the person who designed the one next door. The two were connected, but they were not the same structure. Brad had his movies. Doug had his businesses. Brad had Hollywood. Doug had Missouri. Brad had an international audience. Doug had communities he was trying to serve. And neither path needed to invalidate the other. That may be the healthiest part of their story. There is no evidence that Doug needed to defeat Brad. There is no evidence that Brad needed to compete with Doug. They simply became different people. And perhaps that was easier because their relationship had begun long before either of them had a public identity. Before Brad was a movie star, he was Doug's older brother. Before Doug became a philanthropist, he was Brad's younger brother. That family connection remained, but their lives had moved in different directions. And then came another question. If Brad's fame was never going to disappear, what would Doug's own legacy ultimately look like? Would people remember him primarily because of the famous actor in his family? Or would they remember the work he built himself? That question brings us to the final chapter. Because perhaps the most revealing part of Doug Pitt's story isn't what he accomplished while standing next to Brad. It's what remained after the comparison was removed. And when you take Brad Pitt out of the headline, there is still a story. A businessman from Missouri. A father. A philanthropist. An international advocate. And a man who spent decades building a life that never needed to look like his brother's. For decades, there has been an easy way to introduce Doug Pitt. He is Brad Pitt's younger brother. It is accurate. It is familiar. And it is almost certainly the first thing many people discover about him. But after looking at Doug's life beyond that one sentence, something becomes clear. That description is no longer enough. Because Doug Pitt did not spend his adult life trying to become another Brad. He built a different kind of life. And perhaps that is the real answer to the question we started with. What happens when your brother becomes Brad Pitt? You learn that fame does not have to be a competition. You learn that two people can grow up in the same family and measure success in completely different ways. And you learn that having a famous name in your family does not automatically give your own life meaning. You still have to decide what you are going to do with it. Brad chose Hollywood. Doug chose business. Brad built stories that reached millions of people through movie screens. Doug built businesses in Missouri and developed a reputation for community involvement and philanthropy. Brad became internationally famous. Doug became internationally involved in humanitarian work. Their paths separated, but they never completely disconnected. Because beneath the fame, the businesses, the charities, and the headlines, they were still brothers. That may be one of the most important details in this entire story. The public sees Brad Pitt as a global celebrity. But Doug's perspective comes from a much earlier version of Brad. The brother who grew up beside him. The older sibling who left Missouri to chase an uncertain dream. The person Doug knew before the world knew their name. And perhaps that is why Doug has never needed to compete with Brad's fame. He already knows the person behind it. There is another reason the story matters. Doug's life shows that there is more than one way to build a legacy. His work with Care to Learn is a perfect example. What began with a disturbing realization about children in his own community grew into an organization that, according to Care to Learn, has now met more than 4.6 million emergent health, hunger, and hygiene needs since 2008. That number is difficult to connect with the phrase Brad Pitt's brother, because that number belongs to Doug's work. The organization exists because he saw a problem, gathered people around it, and helped build a system designed to respond. And the same pattern appeared in his international humanitarian work. Doug became the first Goodwill ambassador to Tanzania in 2010, and has been involved with World Serve International and Clean Water initiatives in Africa. Again, the connection to Brad is part of the story. But it is not the whole story. Doug has even used the unusual attention surrounding his family name in a completely different way. In 2012, he appeared in Virgin Mobile Australia's humorous campaign built around being the second most famous Pitt. The joke worked because the world already knew the premise. There was Brad, and then there was Doug. But Doug understood something that made the joke more interesting. He could acknowledge the comparison without allowing the comparison to define him. The commercial became a way to turn the strange reality of his life into something useful and entertaining. And according to St. Louis magazine, the campaign also helped raise awareness for Care to Learn. That may be one of the smartest things Doug ever did with his connection to Brad. He didn't pretend the connection didn't exist. He didn't act embarrassed by it. And he didn't spend his life trying to outrun it. He simply found a way to use it. There is a lesson hidden inside that. You don't always have to escape the thing that makes you different. Sometimes you can acknowledge it, accept it, and then decide what you want to build around it. Doug did exactly that. And there is something else worth remembering. For much of his life, Doug chose Springfield. He could have moved anywhere. He had the financial ability to live in almost any city. He had access to a world most people never experience. But he chose to raise his family in the same part of Missouri where he had grown up. He once described being able to raise his children anywhere in the world as a luxury, but said he chose Springfield because his family was there and because it was home. That choice says more about Doug than any celebrity headline ever could. Brad's world became global. Doug's remained deeply connected to home. And neither one had to be wrong. They simply wanted different things. That is why the title of this story should not really be interpreted as Doug escaped Brad Pitt's shadow. That would still make Brad the center of Doug's story. The deeper truth is different. Doug built a life where the shadow became less important. He didn't have to step out of it dramatically. He simply kept walking. Toward business. Toward family. Toward Springfield. Toward philanthropy. Toward Africa. Toward causes that mattered to him. And eventually, the distance between his identity and his brothers became much larger than the headlines suggested. Brad Pitt became famous because the world watched him. Doug Pitt became meaningful to many people because of what he did when the cameras were gone. And perhaps that is the difference between fame and legacy. Fame asks how many people know your name. Legacy asks what changed because you were here. Brad has his answer. Doug has his own. And neither answer needs to be bigger than the other. Because the most interesting thing about the Pitt brothers may not be that one became a movie star and the other didn't. It may be that they grew up under the same roof and still managed to become completely different men. One built a career in Hollywood. The other built a life in Missouri and beyond. One became one of the most recognizable faces on Earth. The other spent years helping people whose names the world would never know. And perhaps Doug Pitt's greatest achievement is not that he managed to avoid living in Brad Pitt's shadow. It is that he never needed to. Because sometimes, the strongest way to define yourself is not by proving that you are different from someone else. It is by becoming exactly who you were meant to be. Brad Pitt is Brad Pitt. And Doug Pitt is Doug Pitt. Two brothers, two paths, two very different definitions of success. And one family story that became much more interesting once we stopped looking at Doug only through the eyes of his famous brother.